This is Kyle Killen, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. My name is Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast. Well, if you've been watching Twitter, you know that a show that I was really impressed with was Awake on NBC. And I'll say again, I think it was one of the best pilots in years. And so I went on Twitter and I noticed that the creator of the show was also on Twitter, Kyle Killen, and I asked him, hey, you want to come on the TV Writer Podcast? And he said yes. And so I am so excited to bring an interview with Kyle Killen today. Just a couple of quick hits. If you want more episodes, go to tvwriterpodcast.com or blip.tv/tvwriterpodcast. Also at the podcast site at tvwriterpodcast.com, you'll find a Twitter database with over 900 writers that continues to climb and lots of other great resources. Speaking about Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter at Gray Jones is my handle. Right now, on to my interview with Kyle Killen. And make sure you watch Awake on Thursday nights on NBC. This is Gray Jones, and I'm here with Kyle Killen, creator of Awake. How are you doing, Kyle?
I'm very good, thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time for this, and honestly, I thought the Awake pilot was the best pilot I've seen in years, and we will get to talk Awake in a bit, but first, we want to start with where you got started. You grew up in Texas.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up in a small town.
Yeah, tell me about that. And when did you get the writing bug, or did you know that you wanted to be in the film industry at that point?
Yeah, to the extent that I understood anything about what the film industry was. I mean, I knew I loved movies and TV and the telling and writing stories. I don't think I had a real conception of what anybody in the business did. I just knew I wanted to be a part of it.
And you discovered USC's film school. Talk about going to USC.
It was USC and NYU, and I applied to SC, and I don't think I actually expected to get in. It was one of those things where I had never written anything. I didn't have any shorts or anything to show them. It was really just an essay saying how and why I loved film. Mm-hmm. And when I got in, I hadn't actually planned to go. It was really one of those things where I applied to apply and didn't imagine I'd end up going, and then I got in, and that sort of changed all the direction, and off I went.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. And now, after SC, you did a few odd jobs, but talk about that time a little bit.
Well, right out of USC, I did the whole interning thing and, reading scripts and so on and so forth. I couldn't afford to do it for free the way many people do. I needed to actually earn money to live in Los Angeles. So I also worked in a stock brokerage from 3 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, and then when that was done, I would go to my internships, and
oh my,
that for me was a recipe for burning out on LA and on film and on everything. So I left and did a number of other things, from tech support to construction, and I guess the one thing they all had in common is no matter what I was doing, I found a way to be writing about it, and that's sort of when I got the idea that I probably wasn't going to be able to shake writing. It was probably something that I was going to end up having to do, and so I kind of circled back through short fiction and started to place some short stories in different publications, and I won an award, and then I started to adapt the short stories back into screenplays, and that's sort of how I got back into film and back to Los Angeles.
Very cool. Now, just so you know, I mean, this is episode 50 of the podcast, and I'm talking to people all the time, and what people who want to break in are told about the industry is you have to get to Los Angeles, and that's where everything is going to happen. And I just find it so encouraging that in some ways, LA broke you. It's like, I'm getting out of here, and yet it still happened. And that is just so encouraging. So tell me about when you first started to get representation and sell things, how that felt.
Well, to your point, LA not only broke me, being broken, I think, is what saved me. I mean, being here, for me at least, and a lot of people do it this way, and it works for them. But for me, doing the internship and reading, not just tons of scripts, but tons of bad scripts that I was only reading because they got the intern to read them, because they weren't they weren't of a quality that they needed anybody else to. And going into every coffee shop and opening my laptop and realizing that everybody else in that coffee shop also was an aspiring screenwriter, like dying to do this job. It became oppressive, and all I could think about was the numbers. All I could think about was all the people who wanted to do this and how few positions there were, and so what would get me noticed and what kind of stories were good. You just start to think all the wrong ways, in my opinion. And when I left and when I started doing other jobs, it was like I'd given up. I mean, it was like that wasn't going to happen. So when I did it, it wasn't, hoping to impress my boss and get him to read a script and maybe recommend me. It was doing it because I wanted to. It was doing it because I had to. And so I think the stuff that came out, there was a lot more freedom and a lot less fear, because it just needed to come out. And if it was any good, great. And if it wasn't, that was also fine. So I had a professor at USC who he said, writing is like a heroin addiction, and if you can quit, you should. And it's odd, but I always thought that was the best advice, because if you can't, then eventually you're going to be forced to find your voice. Eventually you're going to be forced to find that thing that makes you you and makes you special and makes you stick out. But if you can, then it isn't for you, and there's no shame in that. Like, ultimately, there is something else that totally is for you, and, your journey is about finding that thing. So getting out is oddly how I got in.
Well, and it's really neat, because that voice that you have is, it's a really daring voice. I mean, when you talk about the Beaver story, Lone Star, Awake, these are not conventional stories, but I think that's what gives them so much appeal. Like, people talk about them, and I think if you just want to do the same old, yikes.
Yeah, I think to some extent that comes from how I got in. I mean, the fact that I didn't know enough to take it seriously, and then when people gave me opportunities, I always assumed that they were making a mistake and that it was sort of my last shot, so I might as well do this instead of that. And I think some of the getting in so late and feeling like it was probably always eventually going to go away gives you a little bit of freedom to say, I guess as long as I'm here, what if we do this? And you're not constantly protecting something. You're actually, I don't know, it frees you up to take risks.
Mm-hmm. And a great risk was the Beaver, which I think was your first big sale, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, so tell me about selling the Beaver and what that experience was like.
I had actually written a screenplay, and I'd gotten representation, and a lot of things that as a young aspiring writer you think that'll do it for you. Like, if I could just get this far, and I was super excited to pass those bars, but then you realize, like, you can't really live on having representation. You need to find a way to make money, and I wasn't. And so my wife got pregnant with twins, and we talked about how different things were going to look in 9 months, and decided that really I needed to take like sort of one last shot at the writing thing and figure out whether or not it was a career or a hobby. So we decided I would just take one more chance, and the Beaver was the thing I wanted to take a chance on, and it actually started as a novel. It was something that it started as a short story, and then it got really long, and then it got insanely long. So for the first 5 months of her pregnancy, I was just writing a novel, and I had hundreds and hundreds of pages, and the story had barely begun, and there were long digressions about Matt Lauer was a major character. Like, it was just kind of crazy and disconnected and full of nonsense. And then I remembered how short screenplays were, and I thought I should just turn this into a screenplay. Like, that'll be done in a week or so. And it wasn't nearly that easy, but ultimately, a week before the twins were born, I handed it into my agent, and a week after, I sold it to Steve Golan, and we started the long journey of producing it.
Yep, and wow, it went through a few permutations in terms of the attachments. Eventually landed with Jodie Foster and Mel Gibson, and oh man, unfortunately that whole public issue with Mel Gibson, I'm sure, hurt the film, but it got made, and you went to Cannes with it, and I mean, it was really well received. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was just an incredible and endlessly surprising experience. Positive and negative surprises, but from not expecting anything from it, let alone to sell it, let alone for it to get made, with Jodie Foster and Mel Gibson. It was just, there's almost nothing that you can complain about. I mean, as you said, it got made. It took us to Cannes. It was a sort of incredible, once in a lifetime experience. And I felt like I was always just along for the ride, and the ride was a lot more insane than any of us anticipated.
Yeah. Well, and then you moved to TV. So tell me about moving to TV to sell Lone Star, because Lone Star you sold in 2009, right? That's just a year later. So what made you decide that you wanted to do television?
Well, I always loved TV. I mean, and especially really, really amazing Breaking Bad, Mad Men, The Sopranos, The Wire. I mean, there was a lot of things that I could sit and watch like they were 20, 30, 40-hour movies. I mean, I was so fascinated by how good TV was getting. And because of the Beaver, I had an opportunity to, just by saying that you love TV, they'll give you a chance to come in and talk about what you might do. And so Lone Star was kind of that same thing. If you're going to get one shot, what would be a show that you'd really be excited about watching? And I don't think I knew enough to know cable show versus network show. I just knew what kind of shows I loved. And I guess a lot of them turned out to be cable shows. So when we went around and pitched it, it got interest from 3 of the 4 networks. And ultimately, Fox's winning pitch for taking it to Fox was, we know what this is. This is actually a cable show, and you're just trying to sneak it onto network. And we actually love that idea. We're up for that. So if you come here, you'll make the kind of show you want to make, and we'll stay out of your way. And, so my experience with Lone Star is so different than I think what people expect, because, well, it's, of course, crushing and disappointing to have it fail in the incredible way that it did. I felt super supported the whole time in this mission to make, a full-on cable show with an anti-hero and some really complicated, not black and white dynamics. And, it ultimately didn't work for any of us, but I felt like we all failed together. It wasn't that Fox didn't support us or Fox, wanted to. If anything, Fox pushed us further in the cable direction. They asked that it be darker, that it be crazier, that if we were going to do this, we really go for it. And, it didn't work, but there's not, I get the sense that there's not that many times over the course of a career where everybody just says, screw it, let's go for this. And Lone Star was one of them. And that was really great.
Well, I think it's no secret that the network executives' favorite shows are cable shows.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Like they're the shows they like to watch, and I'm sure, and everything I've heard anyway is that they just really want to try to tell those kinds of stories on network TV. It doesn't always hit with the audiences, but good on them for wanting to try.
Yeah, I think they're like a lot of us. If you're around all of it, if you read everything and you watch everything, then you very quickly become tired of things that are just like each other. And what you see is a lot of things that are extraordinarily similar. So things that stand out, and I think this is really why Lone Star was critically well received. Critics, their job is to watch everything. So much of it is very, very similar and trades in a narrow range. And that doesn't mean it can't be really well done. It just means if you're watching all of it, you're going to feel like you've seen it before. So I think just the newness of it is what appealed to critics. I just think that doesn't necessarily sync up with your average American's experience. They don't watch everything. They have a real job and a real life. And when they come home, they're not looking for something that pushes the boundaries of what entertainment is. They're just looking for a reliable hour of entertainment and release. And they can get that in a lot of different places because it doesn't feel, I think, to the average American like they're watching everything. So a lot of things that might seem repetitive to an executive or a critic, I think are just going to feel great to your average TV viewer. And I think that's sort of the weird job of trying to do something you're excited about and yet that has the potential to find a really, really wide audience.
I almost think that there would be a path, and if there's any networks listening, like especially these companies that own both cable and the network paths, to start something out on cable and then move it to network TV, like to let it find an audience and then bring it to a bigger audience. But anyway, I digress.
I think that may make more sense than the alternative. I think what people, in the wake of Lone Star and a number of other shows, is that everyone says, well, it's obviously a cable show. Why don't you just move it to cable? And I think what people fail to understand is the models are so different in terms of, how they're financed and how they're made profitable, that once you're on network, it's a certain type of machine, and it's really hard to take that thing somewhere else. I actually think you'd have a better shot at doing exactly what you're describing. If you can make it on cable, then that is probably something that you could port over to a network. But then I think the question would always be, why would you? Something that's an incredibly successful show on FX. And something like The Walking Dead has really demonstrated that, like, there is no handicap to being on cable. The Walking Dead mops the floor with every other hour-long drama on everything. I mean, it kills the numbers that every network drama gets. So it's reached a place where a channel is a channel, and if something has the potential to be a cultural phenomenon, it can be a cultural phenomenon with the numbers, not just with the critics, on a channel like AMC.
Well, but by the same token, I mean, you signed an overall deal with Fox. I mean, they believe in your smart storytelling, obviously.
Yeah, and I think the reason I did that is because of what we talked about with Lone Star. Like, I felt incredibly supported by these people, and the day after that show got canceled, they weren't ushering me out the door. They were saying, "We love that experience. It didn't work, but we enjoyed it. What else you got?" And I think when you run into people like that, who are not only willing to take chances, but when they don't work out, they're ready to sign up for another one. You want to work with those people, and that's why I stuck around.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't wait to talk about Awake, and now we can. I just loved the pilot. And I said on Twitter, I'll say it here. I mean, drama for thousands of years at its core has always been about conflict. And what better conflict could you have than this man just having the two halves of his life wrenched from each other. And so tell me a little bit about how you came up with this idea. And I should mention Lone Star and this one, both kind of about two realities, but this one with a more sympathetic character. Was that something you wanted at the outset?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of Awake is in a lot of ways a reaction to what happened with Lone Star. I mean, I knew when I sat down to do it that I was writing a pilot for network, and having just tried the cable style show on network and having had it not really work, I think I sort of examined a lot of the issues that people thought might have been part of sinking Lone Star and asked whether or not there was a way to address them with the next project. So I think Awake probably wouldn't be what it is without Lone Star. I mean, obviously, as you pointed out, they've got similar themes in terms of duality and a man caught between two worlds and utterly refusing to give up on either one of them. And there was a lot of that just floating around in my head as Lone Star ended, and that got married to this idea of dreams and reality, and the idea that your brain is really responsible for what you understand as being real, and I don't think you realize how thin the tether is that holds you to the reality everybody else acknowledges. And so I got interested in this idea of not being sure when you were awake or when you were asleep, and put all that in the blender. But as you said, the main character, rather than being someone that you were not sure how you felt about, rather than being an anti-hero, was somebody that you were, from the outset, you should be extraordinarily sympathetic to. You root for him to somehow have everything, whereas I think in Lone Star, that was what you were asked to do, but you felt really conflicted about it, because having everything for him was wrong, and somehow having everything for Michael Britton feels feels right, if slightly crazy. It feels emotionally right. And, I think the procedural element, something that was close-ended, so that if the first time that you watched the show was in week 8 because someone had relentlessly been telling you to check it out, you wouldn't understand everything, but there'd be enough there for you to enjoy an hour of television and then think about whether or not you wanted to go back and catch up. And certainly one of the things that was difficult in trying to, save or campaign for Lone Star was that by week 2, if you were begging people to watch week 3, you also needed to say, and would you mind going back and catching up on weeks 1 and 2? Because it was like reading a book. You couldn't start in the middle. There's only one place you could begin.
And further to that, I mean, a couple of things. Lone Star was a premise pilot. This wasn't. And also, NBC released the pilot early online. Talk about that.
I'll do the first part first. Lone Star was a premise pilot in that you didn't fully understand the main character's dilemma until the end of the first episode because he hadn't fully created that dilemma. And I felt like that was fine given the type of super serialized storytelling that Lone Star was going to be. I absolutely set my task for Awake in that I would do a premise teaser, but that if in the first 10 minutes you didn't fully understand everything about what this show was going to be, then I had failed. One of the weird things that you do when you create a show is you test it, you take it out, and you show it to these audiences who have a little dial that they turn up and down in reaction to what they're seeing. And testing Lone Star was one of the craziest, most nerve-wracking experiences because people you could see from their dials that they didn't understand what the show was until the end. And while they had a really great reaction, you wish somehow that they had been locked in to what was coming. If they had understood how problematic the situation could be earlier, it felt like you could have kept more of them on board. And so with Awake, it all had to be done before the first commercial break. And I think that's a reason that the Hulu and iTunes experience of releasing it early, I think was helpful. I think that there was a lot of talk about it being a complicated or tricky or problematic concept for people, that it would be hard for them to follow. And the response that I saw through those channels really, it belied that people said, you know what, 10 minutes in, you totally get it. And then the story goes. So I think just sharing it with people so that they could say, you know what, it's really, you don't have to be a genius. It's pretty simple. And hopefully that created some positive word of mouth.
Yeah, well, it is high concept in that, like, when I've told people about this idea, it's very easy to get across. And as soon as you understand the conflict that this guy is in, people say, wow, I want to watch that. But the interesting thing, actually, my son and his girlfriend watched the pilot, and they said that where it really got interesting was when Britton said at the end that he doesn't want anything to change. And I love that. And that absolutely is his conflict. But do you see anything scary about that in terms of maybe envisioning episode 100?
Well, sure. I mean, he understands his situation in a static way, which is my wife is over here and my son is over here, and I'm going to hold on to this for all eternity. And I think what he doesn't get, and where the conflict and drama and hopefully hundreds of episodes comes from, is the fact that those two people aren't going to stand in one place. Their lives don't contain each other, and they're going to run in opposite directions. And if Britton wants to hold on to both of those, he's going to increasingly be holding on to things that are going in opposite directions. And he ends up sort of being this Stretch Armstrong character in the middle, being actively pulled apart. And I think that's really where the story lives for us. There's so much talk about what's real and what's not, and how will we play with that mystery. And we do. I mean, it's obviously baked into the concept of the show, and it's part of examining sort of his mental state is about questioning what is and isn't real. But the conflict and the emotion for us comes from, how do you live two lives that are running away from each other? How do you be that person in the middle? How do you be fully invested in two things that are somehow mutually exclusive. Those are the kind of stories that we're hoping to tell and are most interested in.
Yeah, and great cast too. I mean, wow, they really sell it. We do have a few fan questions that were submitted that I'd like to get to. One of them is from Kiki. She said she saw the first episode of Awake and loved it, but she's wondering how you're doing your psych session research, and if is it important to you that it is real, or is this just to play with the story?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, it's important that it has an air of truth. It's important that it feels plausible, and obviously each therapist has a really different take on his situation. One is much more supportive and one is much more combative, but they both take that stance in the hopes that they can help and guide him out of what they see as a bad situation. I think we've done a lot of research on the way the mind works and the way that we process and understand reality, but there is nobody in a situation quite like his. So you end up making up a lot of reactions to problems that nobody else has had. So I think there's an element of fiction buried under what we hope is a feeling of truth.
Cool. And we had a few questions on the room that you run, and in particular, like what's your staff like, and is it what's your staff like? How's it composed, and how what's the room like?
It's a relatively small staff, and I think we put together in the beginning what we hoped would be a group of people with a lot of experience. We knew it was going to be a very, very, very difficult show to figure out and write, and even if it meant having to write more often, we just wanted to keep the rotation such that when you sent somebody away with a draft, you felt really, really strongly that they would deliver a great piece of material. The consequences of using highly experienced people like that is they tend to have other obligations. And so throughout the season, and our season went longer, we shut down for a month to just sort of try to take in what it was that we had done and what we had learned, and make sure that going forward we were repeating the things that had worked and avoiding the things that hadn't. So that additional time meant that some of our more experienced staff stepped away to do other projects. And I think what was most fascinating and heartening is the newest members of our staff, the youngest members, really, really stepped up phenomenally in those final few episodes and took a lot of responsibility and ownership of what hopefully you'll see towards the end of the season. So it was an incredible experience, not just to make the show, but to watch people go from brand new to really experienced and really reliable over the course of the season.
Very, very cool. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. Do we have time for one or two more?
Sure,
cool. Thomas asks, what do you look for when hiring writers? What kind of samples do you like to read?
I'll read whatever your best sample is. I've hired people off of specs and mostly off of pilots. And for me, it kind of goes like this. A pilot shows me everything in your toolbox. There's nothing harder than doing a pilot. You have to create all the characters. You have to create the whole world. You have to explain it to me very, very quickly, and yet give me a sense of what your show is and how it's going to last for 100 episodes. If you can do all of that, you're an exceptionally talented individual, and I'd be lucky to have you on staff. At the same time, I've read spec episodes of different shows that are so great, they play in my mind as if they were really shot. That one of my favorite episodes of The Sopranos, it turns out, was not an episode of The Sopranos. It's just a sample that someone submitted for Lone Star, and it was so brilliantly rendered.
Wow!
Not only did I see it all happen, in my memory now. It's up there with the best episodes of the show. So to me, the bar is sort of there. If you're going to do a spec of an episode, the only way it's really going to work for you is not if people say, yeah, it's kind of just like that show. It's got to be like one of the best episodes of that show. And I think if you do that, then you really stand out. Otherwise, I think you're better off writing a pilot. I mean, there's so much going on there. I'll be a little more forgiving. I definitely understand the challenge of having to create it all from scratch, but demonstrating that you can do all of that is also a really powerful tool in convincing people that you're somebody they want to talk to.
Mm-hmm. And Dave Bullis asks, what do you recommend to new writers who are trying to pitch and write a new show / pilot? And I've heard that you even, maybe this is legend, pretended you were a courier and dropped scripts off around town?
Yes, and I probably wouldn't recommend that, and that may not be repeatable, but I lived in Texas and I just didn't know how to do anything. And so that seemed oddly like the most logical way. I guess having worked in the various places as an intern, I was aware that there was always in every office this sort of stack of material that no one was quite sure where it came from, and yet they were scared to throw it away. So it get put in a really tall stack, and someone, usually the intern, would eventually be assigned to read it and see if there was anything good in there. And it always felt like, to me, my goal was just to get in one of those stacks, and then I would have to count on the fact that the material would be good enough that one by one, the lowest member of the totem pole would hand it to someone above them, until eventually someone at a much higher level would read it and say, I don't know where this came from, but it's actually worth pursuing. And so I put my thing in 100 stacks, and eventually somebody called.
So that wouldn't be what you would recommend for pitching a new show?
I would recommend whatever works. That happened to work for me. I don't know that it would. I don't know that it would work for anybody else. It's the most common question is like, how do I get an agent? How do I get started? And it's the weirdest situation in that it works both ways. On the one hand, everyone feels like the system is closed. Everybody pulled up the ladder behind them, and nobody wants to hear from new voices because there is no recognized channel for how to submit your material. How do you get started? I mean, everybody says you can submit query letters, but query letters get thrown away, and you can't submit scripts. And, it's like you have to know somebody to get stuff handed in. So it feels very, very, very closed off. But the irony is, on the other side of the fence, people are desperate for new talent, new voices. Everybody wants to be the person who finds an undiscovered gem first and says, I brought this person in. So they're actually hungry for new talent and aspiring people. It's just there's no good system for matching those two groups up. So it's inevitable that everybody's how did you get represented story is crazy and different because it almost seems to take magic. And I think that's the one reason everybody says you have to live in LA, because you have to be around the system, pushing in at 100 different places to eventually find that weak point where you slip through the wall, because there isn't a door.
Very cool. Well, that is a great place to end up. And I really, really appreciate you taking this time. And hey, I also really appreciate you not taking the safe road and bringing such interesting television. I mean, it's definitely TV that I love to watch. And it's Thursday nights on NBC. And anybody who's listening obviously has to check it out. And you're on Twitter, Killen8.
That's it.
Cool. So definitely follow Kyle on Twitter and get all the great updates. And my hope is I think you guys got a 1.9 with the first episode. My hope is that there were a whole bunch of people that checked out the pilot online and maybe didn't think they had to watch live that day, and that they'll all merge together with that 1.9 and be higher on the second week. So.
Well, the great thing about TV is you never have to wait more than a week to find out if you're right or wrong. So we'll know soon.
Yeah. Well, I really, really appreciate it, and best of luck to you, Kyle. And I really hope this goes many seasons.
Thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate the interview.
Okay. Bye-bye. And that was my interview with Kyle Killen. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to see Awake, well, why wouldn't you? It's an awesome show. Thursday nights on NBC. Check it out. Make sure you do see the pilot. It is available online. And then watch all the episodes after that. Make sure let's support this great, great show. Do follow Kyle on Twitter at Killen8. And while you're doing that, follow me on Twitter at Gray Jones. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web.